Welcome to Clinical Trialblazers, a podcast of Biotech, where we dive deep into the journeys of industry leaders shaping clinical research and biotech innovation. I am your host, Alberto Grignolo. In this episode, I'm joined by Lyla Bibi, who is a partner at Goldman Sachs and runs their healthcare equity capital markets business. With her expertise in capital markets, Lyla is known for her analytical skills and deep understanding of biotech market trends. Lyla's role at Goldman Sachs allows her to utilize her financial acumen and work alongside some of the top minds in the industry, contributing to innovative solutions that cater to a diverse global clientele. Today, we will discuss Lyla's career journey, the challenges and opportunities in partnering with the biotech community, and her insights on the future of biotech innovation. Lyla, it's a pleasure to be with you today. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Alberto. Thrilled to be here.
Let's dive in. Would you take me back to when you realized you wanted to pursue the path that led you to where you are today? Was it all intentional? Was it accidental? Was it serendipitous? What happened?
Yeah, I wish I could say it was intentional. The reality is it's a lot of serendipity, and I think a lot of really important leaders and mentors along the way. I actually joined Goldman now back in 2006. Prior to Goldman, I had spent time in equity research at a firm called Sanford Bernstein, which is now part of AllianceBernstein. And I had the good fortune with working with a couple of the analysts there who covered the healthcare sector across med devices, healthcare services, payers and providers, and were close to a number of the pharma analysts, biotech analysts. And so it was really that formative period of time that got my interest piqued in healthcare as an industry. And when I went to Wharton for business school, they had a phenomenal healthcare management program, which I was fortunate enough to get in. And so I spent my 2 years down in Philadelphia doing a healthcare management and finance dual MBA, and had the good fortune coming out of that summer to intern at Goldman. And I was placed in the healthcare equity capital markets group. It was a phenomenal experience. I learned from incredible people. And coming off of that, started actually in our financial institutions group, so not in healthcare, notwithstanding the summer experience. And then in 2014, they asked me to move over and partner with the gentleman who was running it at the time and really build out our growth equity business. And so had a front row seat to a lot of the innovation and capital raising that really began in that mid-2015 era that has begun today. So I'm thrilled to be here. It's been a wonderful journey.
You are working specifically in the biotech space, and what attracted you to that space in particular? Again, were you assigned to it? Did you ask to be involved in that space? How did that come to be?
The reality is there's also a lot of personal interest that I have in biotech as a sector. If you take a step back and you say, the innovation that we all see and touch in our daily lives around medicine really comes out of this community. As you think about not just all of the developments around predictive testing and assays that allow us to create more precision around illness and diseases, the therapies that are being created, that are being run in clinical trials today, that are the medicines for tomorrow. It's just personally so captivating as a collegiate undergrad studying political science and understanding the intersection around the political and regulatory landscape across our sector is also personally very interesting to me. And so, for 1,000 reasons, every day, I love my day job for what I do, but it's also very personally enriching and exciting for me.
Did you have any role models or mentors that helped shape your career and might still be guiding you today?
Yeah, look, you couldn't start a conversation without saying my mom, because she's been a luminary in my career. She was an investment professional for 40 years, just retired, no healthcare exposure whatsoever. So the lines are always very separate between her and I. But I think in observing her career and understanding, I think what was really important was really to find passion in what you do and the work that you do. And that makes the work actually a very enjoyable part of your life. And I think that has been a truism around my entire career. I've had the good fortune, and Goldman is just a remarkable place to grow up as a professional. The longevity of partners at this firm, the ability to learn from some of the best advisors across strategic advisory, financial advisory, then the training, of the client comes first, taking a long-term view. I think it's just such an important learning to really understand how do you build, trusted relationships that grow into really important thought partnerships that we as a firm get to provide to our corporate clients.
I want to ask you an important question now. For the past decade, I've been asked to mentor aspiring leaders, women in particular, and I've become personally more sensitive, more attuned into the challenges that women face, particularly in the corporate world and other parts of the world. And McKinsey has published about the broken rung on the corporate ladder and how that rung on the ladder from entry level to manager is often broken, particularly for women. And so I want to ask you perhaps a delicate question. How has it been for you to be in an environment that, correct me, but appears to be still very male-dominated? How has it been? Has it been challenging? Has it been easy? Have male sponsors helped you go up the corporate ladder? Can you shed some light on your journey as a woman in the financial world? There are prominent women in this world. Carla Harris, Morgan Stanley comes to mind, and others. But how has your journey been?
No, it's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it. I feel like sometimes it's like the third rail of conversations. I would say it's been amazing at Goldman. I'll pick up where I left, which is you have to love what you do every day. And so much of what I love is not, yes, the clients, yes, the industry, yes, the kind of advisory work that we do, but it's also the people. And I've had the good fortune of being surrounded by a cohort of professionals, both female and male, that have been huge advocates of my career, that have been very helpful guides as you navigate complex personal questions, journeys, starting a family, getting married, the transition, the balance, or the so-called balance, and having perspectives, that are almost, gender agnostic, that have been, I think, a critical part of the longevity of staying here. And I think, candidly, we have, a great track record within our healthcare team, within equity capital markets, of really cultivating and promoting women, partly because I think we're there to support each other. And it's not just the women supporting women. It's all genders supporting each other. And I think allowing people to cultivate a life that is meaningful to them and what defines that is really important to longevity in this career. And in my case, I've got 2 kids of my own. I have 2 stepkids. I'm married. I live in Connecticut. And so there's a lot of stuff that fills up my free time. And I found that the firm and leaders of the firm have just been incredibly embracing over my journey from associate to VP to MD to partner, in really finding the right way to calibrate, professional ambition, personal needs, and it's been the reason I've stayed.
You have a very full personal and professional life. Do you have a one-line recommendation for other women in your similar situation, if you will, as to how do you cope with such fullness personally and professionally?
It's important that you surround yourself with people that are supportive of you, both professionally and personally. And I think it drives a huge amount of just flexibility in how you think. I say, just like biotech and drug development is not linear, careers in finance are not linear, and there are moments that you feel like you're accelerating and moments you feel you may be stalling, and recognizing that's all okay in a longer arc, and to really just surround yourself by people that can then help you identify, what you need to be doing as you think about moving to the next level professionally, but also what you need to be doing to attend to the needs personally that are important to you, whether that be family, whether that be other hobbies, other ambitions, philanthropy, et cetera.
Thank you so much for sharing those insights, which I'm sure will be relevant to many, many people among our listeners. Getting back to dollars and cents, if you will. It's a competitive funding environment. I don't have to tell you that. So what recommendations do you have for biotech companies to maximize their potential of attracting investments?
It really comes down to identifying and articulating the differentiated clinical proposition that you as an organization are navigating. And I think the ability to continuously develop new therapies for existing conditions continues to be really important. The ability to exhibit a scientific path to a first-in-class medicine for a disease that has no treatment is hugely important societally, but also as we think about our industry. And so I do think, for companies that are thinking through investments at different cycles, it's really articulating quite clearly what is the value proposition, what is the science behind the strategy, understanding that you need to align a set of stakeholders with that vision. Biotech is an industry of duration. You need to have investors that at various points are aligned with the duration of the clinical outcomes that you are solving for. and that you have a funding base that allows you to get to the next set of inflection points, whether that be regulatory, whether it be clinical, whether it be commercial, that allow you to then generate a return on that investment. And having a team in place that is deep and specialized in their domains is important. I think a huge part, and I'm sure we'll talk to it around how do you think about the importance of leadership in these organizations. I think there's a statistic, there's over 1,000 private companies today in biotech, and leadership does become a really important part.
In this environment of, at least in the United States, of decreased public funding of innovation, the government is getting out of funding a large portion of NIH, for example, in universities. Do you worry as an investor, an advisor, that there may be less to invest in if basic research, basic innovation is defunded or funded much less? As
a perennial optimist, I would say I would envision that the world that we are navigating is going to continue to find ways to allow science to grow and development and discovery to flourish. How that gets funded privately versus publicly, I think, is going to continue to be an evolving part of our regulatory landscape. But I think it's a critical part of the early ideation and clinical discovery that underpins so much of the medicine today. And that's one piece of the funding apparatus. Where I sit is in the later stages. We're institutionalizing the partnership of institutional capital with companies, whether that be in private and public form. And so I do think we continue to be encouraged by what we see both around venture capital formation, venture capital deployment, public equity funds, and how they position around biotech as a subsector within healthcare and candidly within the broader investment or growth equity ecosystem. And so I am hopeful that we will continue to find ways to innovate.
Yeah, the subtext of my question is there space and interest in the private sector to backfill some of the defunding? In other words, the return on investment, on a decades-long basic research pursuit can be perhaps too long for the private sector to stomach.
I hope that we continue to see pockets of funding. And again, that will evolve as the aggregate dynamics in our overall ecosystem evolve. There is still an incredible amount of focus around new company formation, scientific innovation, really driving a science-first framework for company creation, and that's incredibly encouraging.
And if that calls for investing for 10 years instead of 5 years, is this something that your sector may be interested in doing?
Yeah, if you actually look and you think what's the life cycle of private to public and then public, depending on when these companies enter the public market, you can have a multi-decade time frame as you think about where the private investments began from a Series A all through an IPO and beyond to a commercial launch. And so, again, so much of it is a function of the product itself. But I do think there is, increasing pools of capital that are creating more flexibility around the duration to this exact point. It's not linear.
Right. Getting back to development stage biotechs, what are some of the things that you look for when evaluating biotech clients and when you evaluate if they will be good candidates for the public equity markets?
And I think, from a public equity perspective, you want to be entering the public markets where there is a somewhat clear framework that's going to drive value creation. Right. And that does not have to be a near term, but it has to be sort of transcribed in a way that I think investors can value and understand the duration of time to which, their investment will see a return. I think understanding the competitive landscape is critically important. And that's going to evolve every quarter, every year, as you think about innovation that occurs around you, both in the U.S. and abroad. And I think it's also companies that have an infrastructure around team. I don't mean infrastructure with a big I. I mean with a team around them that has the requisite domain expertise to really allow them to navigate the complexities of drug discovery. As you think about, chief scientific officer, chief medical officer, finance team, the CEO and strategy team, to really how do you build for an independent path in the public markets? And whether that be a single product company, whether it be a platform company, whether it be a product that has multiple different utilization cases, it's being somewhat clear around kind of what the value proposition is.
Companies want to raise capital. You play in that space all the time. So I'd like to ask you, what are some of the mistakes you see companies making when preparing to raise capital?
I think very few companies make true mistakes in raising capital, right? I think the reality is so much of the framework around capital raising goes back to what is the discipline and structure around cash utilization. So how do we think about cash runway, cash burn in the context of what you will be generating around clinical or regulatory returns on that investment. So I think that's really important to have discipline around that. And that discipline has to tie into the strategy of the company, right? As you think about how you are deploying capital in a world where the cost of capital is increasing. I've said this to boards, I've said this to management teams, like nobody dies of dilution, everyone dies of not having enough funding. But the reality is everyone lives dilution, right? And so I do think it's important to think through, going back to that cash runway utilization framework, is just really understanding how do you titrate spend to allow you to really get to inflection points that are going to determine, is the clinical data set supportive of further advancement as you think about ultimately delivering medicine to patients.
Would you define dilution for me?
Yes. I think about it in the context of equity dilution, when you are basically selling a piece of a company to raise primary capital. Now, there's other forms of dilution, right? You can sell royalties, and that's a piece of your revenue stream that ultimately will be paid out to another party. There are other points of structured debt that can create different points of dilution further down the income statement. But that's what I think about in the context of equity dilution, which is for most biotechs how they fund in the kind of early to mid stage of their life cycles.
Moving to your personal views of CEOs, what are some of the characteristics of the successful biotech CEOs you have worked with?
Yeah. I think first and foremost, it's a leader that really aligns the strategy with the science. We've talked about that before. That creates a culture within the organization. It's an amorphous topic, but I think any industry where the human capital is a huge part of the differentiation of what you have as an enterprise, it's really important to create a culture of alignment, right? We've said this before, like drug discovery is not linear. There are setbacks in every clinical trial and every clinical path and journey, and having a team that is really working towards a shared goal and transparency around that's really critically important. I think having a set of leaders around the CEO that really bring a complementary view, you don't have an echo chamber of decision making, is I think really important. I think CEOs that focus on how to build alignment across the various stakeholders, whether it be board members, whether it be scientific advisors, whether it be public equity shareholders, and really understanding how to balance all of those objectives, recognizing as an operator and the head of strategy, you really have to chart, you are true north in those discussions. And then I think it's CEOs that also are playing the long game, right? There are some companies that will grow and become the next multi-$100 billion generational biotech company. There are others that will be bought as part of strategic M&A. And there will be others that will have to reevaluate how they think their kind of scientific path will be. And you don't really know in the beginning. We all hope everyone is in door A. But you don't really know what your path will be, but you really do need to plan for that. You need to plan for how do I build, long-term success as a company who is really focused on delivering value to patients and medicine to patients.
In this podcast series, I've been able to interview a number of CEOs, and to a person, they've all said being resilient is extremely important, the ability to bounce back. Do you think that's, how do you view it? Is resilience something you look at?
I think resilience is huge in every profession, but without a doubt in biotech. It is not a predictive industry. There are so many variables that can impact the outcome of a clinical trial, of a regulatory discussion, of a patient journey, and having the ability to adapt and reconstruct the path is hugely important.
What about the role of what might be your personal trust in a biotech CEO and their team when you're making your initial investment or maybe a follow-up investment? Does trust play an important role there, almost aside from results?
Yeah.
If it's even fair to draw that distinction. Yeah. Can you have trust without results?
100% you can have trust without results, right? I think there is, again, in my seat as an advisor for companies, trust is a critical part of our relationship. My trust in them, their trust in me and our firm, right? As we think about what the partnership is. And I think it's the building blocks of what creates long-term partnerships across not just a company's life cycle, but across leaders' life cycles, right? This is a very connected ecosystem. There are CEOs that will go on to be CEOs of new companies. There will be CEOs that go on to be board members of a variety of other companies, maybe in biotech, maybe in other parts of healthcare. There will be other parts of the organization, CSOs, CMOs, that will grow to be leaders of other companies. And so I think it's that trust element is hugely important.
Can you trust a CEO who has failed to deliver results because, well, the drug failed in phase 3 or in phase 2? Can you still trust a CEO that has encountered difficulties and failures? Is there such a thing as failure, or is there only learnings? There's never really any failure per se.
Yeah, I definitively think you can trust without, I'll say, like clinical success or commercial success. It is a very small percentage as you think about the number of drugs that enter clinical development that make it ultimately to be medicine that we will consume as patients. So I do think that there is learning in the failure. And I think what is important in the failure is transparency. It's a recognition of what caused a failure, right? Is it the construction of the trial? Are there variables that confound the outcomes? There are so many different things that can define or redefine success and failure. And those goalposts can shift as you think about the competitive landscape, and what may be success in one period may be deemed failure or parity in another. And so I do think that transparency is a huge part of how do you maintain trust, even in challenging setbacks.
Well, knowing the outcome in biotech is before it happens is not possible.
Yeah,
never has been. Trust can be as simplistic as making sure that somebody never lies to you, or it can be as complicated as trusting the entire portfolio of skills that the CEO and their staff have. Is that a fair distinction? In other words, you don't want to be lied to. No, nobody does. But could you tolerate somebody sort of not telling you the whole truth, but being otherwise trustworthy?
I don't think there's a half truth in life. I sort of live in whole truths. And so I think you have to have trust in terms of transparency as the foundation to which you build a house on. But there are so many other variables that encompass being trustworthy, not just I'm not being lied to. But I think it's very hard to say you would trust someone that told you half of the story.
Turning to the markets for a moment, what changes have you seen in the market over the last few years? Has this changed how you advise both private and public companies around capital formation and financing opportunities? Again, I'm not a market specialist by any stretch of the imagination. You are. I'm standing here to be educated by you, please.
It's been a very tough, I'll say, operating environment for the last 5 years for most biotechs, most innovative biotechs, partly because the funding environment has been complicated by, I think, challenged returns in the public markets. Interestingly enough, last year was the second highest year in biotech equity capital markets, which is a somewhat surprising phenomenon in the construct of a market for biotech that had been stagnant to bias to the downside. And I do think part of what created, I'll say, that positive flywheel over the course of 2024 was really a recycling of capital around M&A. And we had a very active M&A year to end 2023. That capital got redeployed into the public markets, as it often does. We are still living with a little bit of the hangover of 150 public companies being born into the markets during the COVID period, and those companies moving through their clinical life cycle now as public entities. So not surprising, we've seen a slowdown of IPO issuance. I think that is something we're very focused on. I know many of our private clients are very focused on when are we going to see a normalization of IPO activity in the biotech sector. We're seeing that resumption in other parts of the growth ecosystem, whether it be med tech, digital tech, actual tech. And I do think there's some encouraging signals there. But I think we are going to continue to see a very disciplined environment from a public equity investor perspective. And I think that's actually a pretty healthy fact pattern as people think about what they are underwriting in the context of the public markets. But we are encouraged by what we see around capital formation and engagement, both in the private and the public biotech funding environment. We see there's continued discipline around capital raising, discipline around dilution, discipline around value. And I think those are all going to be really important table stakes as we think about what does the biotech funding environment look like, not just over the next 6 months or 9 months, but over the next 3 to 6 years.
Is what happened in 2020, as you described it, potentially due to a sentiment that, well, there was a pandemic, we needed answers very fast, and science was going to be the answer, and therefore it was very important to invest in biotech because our future collectively hangs on scientific innovation. Was that an element of the thinking at that time?
When you have that record level of issuance, it would tell you that there is a broader generalist view and participation around our sector that is broader than just the people that live and breathe biotech as an investment every day. Without a doubt, I think it awakened probably an understanding of the importance of funding innovation. But I think in the years that passed, it was also a reminder that it is a complex industry. Drug development is not predictable. And there are setbacks, there are successes, there are competitive dynamics that emerge, the advent of technology and how that has created kind of speed and innovation within our industries. And some of those learnings are all being experienced real time. And the access to capital in that period of time, I think, just put it on a much broader stage.
So have we hit a valley in investment and now we're climbing back out because perhaps people are realizing that we still need scientific innovation, even though the pandemic has been largely addressed? At least one big government is defunding research. And therefore, capital needs to go towards scientific innovation because at some point in the future, we will be glad that we have scientific innovation and that we have therapies for things that might surprise us, or for chronic diseases that still need to be resolved, or for rare diseases that are looking for alleviation and possibly cures. So are we on a upward curve of renewed interest in funding scientific innovation, whether from the private sector or the public sector?
Yeah, I think we continue to see strong interest for those that participate in this part of the ecosystem. I think how the generalist investors view biotech, it still is very niche-y in its early stage. As you think about a phase 1 or a phase 2 company, which is different than a biotech company that is commercializing a drug that people can see and touch and understand. And I do think that bifurcation we do see in the investor landscape today on the public side. And I think that's not a bad thing. I think investors really do need to understand in the context of biotech what the risk framework is for what they are underwriting at different stages. And I think there are different pools of capital that are more equipped than others to really evaluate that at a stage, a Series A or a Series B versus a company that's a commercial company.
Well, that brings us to the end of our conversation. Lyla, I want to thank you for your insights and your optimism, which really comes through loud and clear. And you had described yourself as an optimist, so I'll take that as a take-home message from me.
Yes, well, I appreciate you taking the time. Thrilled to be here, and thank you.
Thank you so much. That's it for this episode of Clinical Trialblazers. Thank you, Lyla, for sharing your insights and experiences with us. Stay tuned, listeners, for more episodes of Clinical Trialblazers, where we will continue to explore human stories behind the ideas and innovations shaping biopharma and biotech. And please take a moment to rate and review this podcast wherever you listen. Clinical Trialblazers is created by Parexel Biotech and hosted by me, Alberto Grignolo. Special thanks to our production partner, Wonder Media Network. Thank you for tuning in. And until next time, stay curious and let's keep pushing the boundaries of clinical research. Bye for now.